welcome you to SDE4 Forum, and more importantly, welcome to the annual TAS Inter-Varsity Debate. My name is Zikri, and this is my partner Risha, and today will be MCs for today's event. So this debate actually has been an annual platform for us to actually advance architectural discussions between two institutions, the National University of Singapore, NUS, as well as the Singapore University of Technology and Design, SUTD. So this debate actually allows everyone from students, architects in practice, professors, and many more to gain insights and generate more ideas about current issues in our industry. So without further ado, I'll begin starting off this event with a brief run-through of today's program.
We'll be starting off with an introduction to the teams, the debate rules, as well as the prizes. And after the introduction and opening speech by our guest of honor, we'll be commencing our debate. At 2:55 p.m., we'll be inviting the audience to actually cast their vote. And as we tally the votes and the judges deliberate on the best speaker, we'll invite everyone for refreshments at level 1 and SD1, where the current archival exhibition is ongoing. After which, at 3:10 p.m., we will gather inside at the same place where the refreshments are, to announce the debate results. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our judging panel for today. So we are very honored today to have 4 judges who are very experienced in the architecture industry. Firstly, we have architect Tian Trip. She's the director of FAR and the vice president of Singapore Institute of Architects.
Okay, we also have architect Chu Yang King. There's also architect Chu is actually the founder of IX Architects.
Next up, we have Prof. Christine, who is the assistant professor at SUTD and also the founding partner of Yogiana Design.
Okay, and last but not least, we have Dr. Joseph Lim, our associate professor in NUS. Thank you again to our judges for joining us this afternoon. We are very honored to have people with your expertise come and critique our session and decide on the best speaker award and also share your insights after the debate ends.
Okay, next I would like to invite architect Chiu Wen-Tian on stage today as our guest of honor to present the opening speech. Architect Chiu is the principal architect for Chiu Architects. And this is the current co-chairperson of the Singapore Institute of Architects. He was actually the president for the Architecture Society back in 2012 and 2013, and today we are honored to welcome you back.
Alright, thank you for the introduction. I didn't expect a long introduction. Okay, firstly, it's great to see everyone here gathered here today for this event. TAS Debate has been something that TAS came up with, I think, all the way back in 2011. Okay, back then was my first year joining TAS Debate, and then in 2012 I was the president, and then we kept the tradition going, and we got the students together. And actually, I remember my time we go together in projector room. Projector room we gathered and have a simple debate section, which followed by mingling session for the students, and it was really fun. I remember at the end of it, they asked me to sing, so maybe later the president will sing. Okay, so let me get this program. So again, thank you to TAS and NUS for inviting me back. So NUS is where I began my journey as an architect, and I'm very grateful to the education, friendship, and opportunities that we found our architecture with them. So TAS Debates recently got SUTD to join it, which is fantastic. As a chair of Singapore Young Architects, it's great to see the intermingling of the students to get to know each other and strengthen the community. So over the years, TAS has never failed to come up with provocative motions for debate, but this year they may have outdone themselves. The belief that social issues can be resolved through architecture is visual thinking. Not sure about you, I get another take when I read it. Debating this motion like in the architecture school is like entering the temple of architecture to denounce the god of architecture. The audacity! The social problem-solving aspect through architecture is what preserves the lure of architecture education. The belief that architects are the protagonists saving an imperfect world through our vision and design. At first glance, this seems to lean towards an obvious sentiment in our local context. The success of HDB through the mass public housing since the 1960s not only resolved our housing crisis, but also established urban planning formula to address community and social equality. Surely, the protagonist says the day, right? Architecture must be the solution to social issues. To the credit of good motion, it challenges and taunts the notion of absolute. Can existing architecture remain relevant in the solution of the social issue it sets out to solve in an ever-evolving and dynamic society? Through times, have new social issues arise from original solutions, or can architecture evolve and retrofit to tackle them? Can new upcoming architecture resolve current world issues, social issues that arise from rapid technological advancement in the digital realm? Are we the protagonists in our own imagination? So I'm here to find out more for myself. The stage is set, take off the gloves, the fiery debate awaits, and I'm sure it will be an exciting one. So I have conveniently excused myself from the duties of being the judges. I leave it to the good hands of the esteemed judges today, Dr. Joseph Liu, Architect Nan Chen, Architect Yang Peng, and Professor Christine. So with that, I wish you all a good debate ahead and enjoy yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that amazing introduction speech and for setting a context for the debate today. I'm sure all of us are looking forward to it as well. So let's now give a big round of applause to introduce our two debate teams. From the SATD team, the team is led by Prof. Daniel Whittaker, and the team consists of Yo Soon Lee and Jennifer Tan.
Okay, and representing the NUS Proposition Party, we have the team mentor, Mr. Tam Wai Hon. And the team comprises of John Chu Geronimo Jr. as well as Louis Lim. Okay, just to recap, the SCTD team will be the opposition party, whereas the NUS team will be the proposition party for today's debate. And next, before we get to the debate, I'd like to thank the Architecture Society Studio, DOA, as well as SCTD for supporting this event. We also like to thank our sponsors, DCA Architects as our platinum sponsor, AG Architects as our gold sponsor, and our silver sponsors, DP Architects, Amir Architects, Chiu Architects, Richard Ho Architects, and Ashwin Kumar, and as well as our prize sponsor for today, Bashir Graphic Tools. So before we get to the debate motion, and so those are our sponsors for today, and our debate motion will be as seen on the screen. So the motion will be that we believe that social issues can be resolved through architecture is wishful thinking. And our description for this is that architecture constitutes the creative synthesis of design and problem solving within a given set of restrictions that more often than not aims to improve people's quality of life. Increasingly, architecture schools are veering towards developing courses on public interest design, while everyone from architects to boutique firms are expanding their portfolio with more socially responsible designs. However, upon a closer inspection, do these efforts make a meaningful impact, or are they just token gestures? Can architecture really play a crucial role in solving social issues, or will these efforts prove futile in the grand scheme of things? And without further ado, I'll now be passing the mic over to the moderator for today, Sean, who will be running through with you the debate format and the debate rules.
Thank you, Zachary. So today's format, we'll start off with a proposition, then after we'll move on to an opposition, and we'll repeat that for another round. Before we'll break off for 35 minutes of questions by each judge. The teams will each get 2.5 minutes to respond to the question. Afterwards, we'll open the floor to the audience to ask any questions that we have. Then we'll end off with final remarks by the opposition, then the proposition, then finally the judges will have their final remark before we start the voting process. So there will be 2 awards today. We have the Best Speaker Award, which will be decided by the judges. And then, of course, we have the Winning Team Award, which will be decided by the popular vote. So we will later have a sticker voting when we exit this place. We'll explain more about it at the end of the session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sean. So, without further ado, we'll now be starting off with the long-awaited Inter-Varsity Debate. So, can I get the first speaker from the NS team? Just get ready, and Sean will prompt you when you're ready. So today, the proposition supports the motion that the belief that social issues can be resolved through architecture is wishful thinking. So it sounds confusing, but we will show that architecture's role and its magnitude of influence in solving social problems is limited. And also harboring this belief is counterproductive. And finally, we will explore how we may recalibrate our expectations moving forward. Okay, here's another obvious statement. Social issues by nature are too complex and multifaceted to be solved by architecture alone. Resolving social issues requires the force of political will, sound economic policies, and cultural sensitivity. Factors to which architecture, by its scope, will find difficult to address. Added to that, architecture as a profession, a practice, and a product is itself inherently subject to its own set of social, political, and economic pressures, which are often at odds with providing social good, curtailing its abilities, if any, to steer building projects towards solving a particular social issue. This will be elaborated on by my second speaker. To illustrate my earlier point, even a problem closely related to architecture, like supplying successful and holistic social housing, be it to solve homelessness or address poor living conditions, rely on many factors apart from architecture and its good, well-meaning design to ensure success. When Singapore faced these very problems right after independence, it took political will to enact the Land Act, freeing up large swathes of land for the building of new housing estates. Sound economic policies such as enforced savings, CPF, provision of cheap loans and grants allowed people to pay for their new homes. The provision of jobs to pay workers, affordable healthcare and education are also critical factors outside the realm of architecture that ensure the success of social housing. What's the point of living in a well-designed housing estate if you're jobless, poor, and sick? Lastly, and this is going to offend a lot of people, the belief that social issues can be resolved through architecture stems from the broad, complex architects and designers often harbor. Just because architecture has a seemingly outsized role in shaping our physical environments does not confer the ability to solve complex social problems. This lofty attitude often prevents us from truly collaborating in other fields and prevents architecture from effective involvement in problem-solving endeavors. That said, we are not trying to belittle the role of architecture or discourage our fellow architects and designers from giving a damn about society. But instead, as my third speaker will conclude, realize our precise roles within the complex nature of solving social problems. Thank you.
Good afternoon, judges, fellow speakers, and guests. My name is Suri. In contrast to the opposing team, this House believes that architecture and spatial design is more than capable of satisfactorily addressing and even resolving the numerous social issues that the past, present, and future generations will face. Let me first begin by proving the undeniable power that architecture and the built environment has as a tool for societal stewardship and accountability to all members of society. To believe that architecture and the built environment has no impact on social issues is to blatantly deny the origins of our own city. In 1947, a mere 75 years ago, the British Housing Committee report condemned Singapore as one of the world's worst slum settlements. Singapore, the famous island state, was, quote, a disgrace to civilized community. And Singapore paid dearly for this, with frequent fires in cramped quarters devastating communities, tuberculosis and other diseases burning through poorly sanitized slums, and early industries struggling to modernize amongst this urban chaos. It is undeniable that major architectural interventions, with the emerging needs of society in mind, such as the HDB flats, along with extensive public infrastructure renewal, turned all of these aforementioned issues around. No other intervention would be able to address the root of the issue, because social welfare and quality of life is fundamentally tied to each member's physical circumstances. To dismiss architectural interventions is to cast away society's most powerful and effective tool in addressing social issues, in contrast to what the previous speaker has said. Next. First, architecture and built environment design can address the most pressing issues associated with the past generation, health and well-being. Modern medicine has provided a swath of treatment regimens. Robotics and engineering has preferred all manner of equipment and health devices.
but only architectural interventions can bridge the gap between a patient's medical needs and human or social needs. For example, the increasing prevalence of co-located healthcare facilities in Singapore, such as the Woodlands Integrated Health Campus, the care home at Senja and Khoo Teck Puat Hospital, prove the benefit of physically bringing the old, sick, and infirm back into safe contact with normal society. And various other studies done in collaboration with NUS, SUTD, and URA have proved that architecture does indeed have benefit for health and well-being in the future. It is remarkable that even at the legislative and governmental level, architecture is respected and esteemed as a uniquely powerful means to tackle social issues where legislative and educational efforts alone have failed. Thanks. Architecture also powerfully tackles economic, environmental, health, and social issues that go hand in hand with urbanization. In Seoul, one of the world's most densely populated cities, Mayor Park Won-soon's social policy approach is revolutionary and outstandingly effective, precisely because building infrastructure and urban environments are harnessed to produce social cohesion and improve urban welfare outcomes. By adapting infrastructure and urban plans specifically to facilitate residents' engagement with and ownership of their environment, grassroots issues concerning the built environment can be resolved from the ground up. An example would be Solo 7017. Architecture and the built environment is the very foundation upon which social change may be enacted, as a physical framework holding society together and facilitating its growth. In this uniquely esteemed position, architecture has the power to enact lasting and meaningful social change, which is the only sensible conclusion for societies that are so radically influenced by the urban environment today. I'll now hand the time to Prof. Ben.
Greetings, everybody, this afternoon. It was interesting that your point talked about being in a jobless or sick condition is not the state that one wants to be in, living in housing. We are on a series of events, such as providing food security within the realm of architecture, for example, building the largest rice processing plant in rural Vietnam, reducing transportation from the field to processing, reducing infection and possibility of disease. Secondly, being poor, new emerging products that architects choose can affect in terms of employing unemployed or underskilled workers to create new products for the marketplace. Recently, Thai professor Manning talked about the recycling of products, fibers and glass fibers together in Bangkok to employ people who are not as in that skilled labor market and able to create products that architects select for the purpose of building buildings, and we specify those products and have direct effect on that. Lastly, within those realms of being ill or infirm, when you mentioned the notice to be sick inside of the space, providing healthcare. Yes.
Thank you very much to the SUTD team. So I think before I begin stating my points, we would like to reiterate some or clarify some assertions we made. So as our team does not believe that architecture does not contribute to social issues at all, but we stress the idea that it can, but most of the time what it contributes is extremely limited. There's a second point about all these things you mentioned, but we believe that I just want to my point. So we believe that architecture can address social issues, but its capacity is limited because these examples you mentioned, they are brilliant, but we also kind of believe that they are perhaps exceptions and just some small examples of architectural projects that have been more successful, but there are also a lot of architectural projects which are either not successful or just have little to no impact at all. But what we want to bring up with this point is this happens exactly because all architecture actually takes place has a very specific way. Is produced in a very specific way. Architecture is usually produced under a system that exhibits two traits. Number one, it often prioritizes economic efficiency above anything else. And number two, architecture is not just made solely by the architect. It's usually in a system that involves multiple stakeholders outside of the architect, such as developers or planners and whatnot. So, and we believe that because architecture is always beholden to the system as such, it significantly reduces the ability of architecture to target social issues. So, about the first idea, architecture and money. Architecture is arguably viewed today first and foremost as an economic commodity. Much of building design today is driven by concerns such as standardization and homogenization, and that limits architecture's ability to come up with design schemes that are truly specific or incisive in tackling social issues. And the second idea that we want to bring up is that under the current mode of production, architects have a very limited ability to control the who, what, or where of a build project, and the inability to control so many of these factors make architecture as a solution to social problem prone to multiple avenues of failures. So let me give you an example, which should be highlighted in my next slide. These are the Pruitt Eagle homes in Chicago, USA, and they were meant to be a solution by the US federal government to the slum housing problem in Chicago at the time. But instead of solving the problem, it actually made it worse, becoming a fertile breeding ground for crime, poverty, and disrepair. So we can wait for the picture to show up, but you will see the project itself. Okay, doesn't matter. But ultimately, it was established in 1976, about 15 years after its construction. So the funny thing about this project is that the architect in charge actually initially proposed that he wanted it to be a mixed-rise development, multiple green spaces, a lot of nice things. And the design at first was accepted by the local authorities. But later on, the federal authorities, the Public Housing Administration, intervened because this project, the original design, exceeded the original cost limits, and they proposed this final form, this uniform type of 11 floors. And historically, there's been a lot of studies to show how this form itself was the very cause of all the issues, the crimes, there was a lot of muggings and whatnot. So what I'm trying to say here is not this specific example, but this example highlights the idea that the architect did not decide what this project finally became. He knew that it was not social housing, but he could not as in the final form was not in the control of the architect. And this is okay, but it becomes a problem when what proposed by other parties is something problematic. And what I'm trying to highlight is that architects sometimes have little ability to reject this under the current system. The second thing, in a broader context, where architecture is located is dependent on factors out of the architect's control. Factors such as zoning, land prices, and general real estate shenanigans play a larger role. So this means that not every architectural project can be built on a location that is most conducive to resolving social issues. So for example, an emergency hospital could be located too far away from the town centre to render fast treatment for patients, or a housing estate for the homeless could be built in an area that provides future opportunities, compounding the economic woes of the very people that it's supposed to help. So we've covered the what, we've covered the where. There's also the idea of who. And when it comes to the who, as architects or in architecture, we cannot control who uses our architecture. Neither can architecture completely control people within it. And this opens the possibility of unwelcome parties hijacking architecture that is meant for social good, for a totally different purpose. So if we go back to the Pruitt Eagle example, we see how this had a very strong social conscience in the project, but in the end it became the perfect place for criminals to prey. To summarize, we understand that architecture can have good intention and it can have an impact, as the other SUTD team has mentioned. But because most of the time, most architecture is constructed in a highly specific system, a system that, number one, is beholden to economic concerns, and number two, seldom provides the ideal conditions for architecture, or the ideal conditions that the architect kind of wants to realize the impact of the design, it is less likely to solve social problems. We do acknowledge, however, that what we kind of covered is the very commercial, what takes place in the very current capitalist system of architecture. We do acknowledge there are many other types of architecture outside there. Ones that are not purely driven by profit, ones that are a bit more experimental. These will be covered by my third and final speaker, John. But what we're trying to show is that architecture isn't in isolation. It always is made through a system. And regardless of the time period, this system will always come with limitations, ones that architects cannot fully control, that will prevent the architect from fully realizing their vision. So that is our point. Thank you very much.
You've heard from Sui about how architecture has more than adequately addressed the social issues of the past and the present. But that's not all. Architecture's ability to resolve social issues extend beyond the present. I will now talk about how architecture is the most important and most powerful tool we possess to tackle the greatest social issue of our time, climate change. To start off, architecture shapes our environment, the places we live, work, and play. Throughout history, architecture has been adapting and changing to fit society's ever-changing needs. With sustainability being more and more of a priority, we need architecture more than ever to facilitate and bring about new ways to live. Next. In the politics of greening by Unison, the author analyzes the impact of open spaces in Singapore, how it is utilized to moderate social behavior. Similarly, architecture brings about change even when we don't immediately realize it. To tackle the issue of climate change, architecture offers two types of solutions, preventive and acute interventions. In preventive interventions, we are looking at goals such as reducing carbon footprint and energy usage. To achieve these very much quantifiable goals, architecture adopts passive and active design strategies to optimize energy performance. Such strategies include harnessing the renewable energy and the use of hybrid cooling systems. The unique thing about architecture is that it can take all these technologies together into one coherent solution that works well together. What other industry possesses such ability? Existing building regulations and awards also help drive and incentivize private firms towards this new sustainability standard. Increasingly, we see more and more such buildings around us. In fact, the building we are currently in right now is one of such buildings to be awarded the Zero Energy Certification. In other words, this building can produce as much energy as it consumes, and at times outperform its predicted values to produce more energy than it needs. This opens a new paradigm for architecture of tomorrow. When we repeatedly expose ourselves to an environment that emphasizes the use of sustainable tools, it helps shape our relationship with the environment around us. And in turn, our mindsets change because of our environment. Moving on to acute intervention, we are looking at tackling the direct consequence of climate change, sea level rise. Millions have been and will be displaced by the rise of sea levels. In just a few decades, much of our land will be submerged underwater. This is where the adaptability of architecture shines. As mentioned earlier, architecture is not limited to past typologies. It can change, evolve, and tailor to different needs. Next. In recent years, we see the rise in popularity of floating homes. Not to mention, the first floating city, Ocean Lakes, is slated to be constructed in South Korea in just the next few years. Architecture allows us to reimagine our way of life, help us survive, and perhaps even thrive in such dire situations. But then I'll pass the time to Prof. Daniel, who will address what the team has said just now.
Thank you. It's interesting to know your fixation on the presence of the free marketplace and the apparent lack of ability of the architect to influence that. Well, the good component is that architects have had the time and the energy and also the influence to influence the consumer. And the very consumer makes choices in such a free marketplace environment. So the consumer now actually pays attention to the energy consumption of the buildings, where after all they're paying an electric bill. The consumer also pays attention to the quality of the air within the buildings that they wish to purchase to live in, and pay attention to the low VOC or volatile organic compound off-gassing of paints, carpet, and other finishes within the building. The consumer pays attention to the technologies that before they did not pay attention to due to the fact that there was not a huge knowledge base about these. And the architects played a huge role in the last several decades, enabling the consumer to make wiser choices on the product that they purchase, both work and live within. These changes are architects' direct effect within. And the example that you chose is not indeed in Chicago, it's in St. Louis. So and it was a Japanese-American architect, Minoru Yamasaki, who created that project. And indeed, there were complex forces of the economic sense that that is a public housing project, not free market enterprise, which is what my was before. So very different from the environment that's unique to disadvantaged Americans in that situation. Thank you.
Thank you both teams for your opening statements. Now we will move on to the judges' remarks question segment. Each judge will be allowed to pose one question to both teams, and each team will each get 2.5 minutes. So we may
Hi, this question goes to the opposition team. The first slide was actually on the example of Singapore, and subsequently see the example of Seoul City and Vietnam. So these are cities that actually evolve because of economic transformation technology. So how would you see the role of architecture without all this transformation happening prior to that? So that's actually something that I like I'm actually talking about in context of a country which is underdeveloped in Africa or very kind of places.
Yes.
So this question is more about the role of architecture in different countries with different economic status. Is that correct? Okay, so how I understand this question is, okay, so if you look at the role of architecture in less developed countries, the role is to get the basic necessities like shelter, healthcare, all these very basic things
architecture brings that to them. So as a society develops, we as humans, we want more things. We want things that are not just needs anymore. We want things like mental health. We need facilities that help us relax. All these luxuries that we as higher income countries can afford. Architecture evolves as well together with these economies. So it's correct to say that architecture is changes according to how the needs of the society itself. But that's precisely the reason architecture exists, right? To accommodate and fulfill the needs of the society at that point of progress.
My question for proposition is actually with the advancements of technology and countries being more mobile and collaborating and so on. So how would you imagine the future, right, of architecture to evolve to tackle all these changes? Because what I see in the slide actually take the past precedent, things that happened in the past. But I think we look forward, right, could be very optimistic because with a lot of things happening and so on and so forth.
I think that in the future, as mentioned by our team, that architecture will become more collaborative profession. As mentioned, we've been passed on this for like not complex. We'll find in more cases we will actually need to collaborate with policymakers. We need to try to even make our voice heard. We may not become project leaders. We need to be accepting that we are not the sole enabler of a change in the physical environment. It is only when we have this kind of attitude of reaching out to communities, reaching out to different specialists, and we think that we cannot do everything, then I believe this is the future of architecture, and this is what will keep it relevant.
Yes, okay. I think one question that both of our teams have skirted so far is what it really means to do, what it really means when we say doing things through architecture. So I would say that a lot of the examples that brought up by our position, to examine them, sometimes a lot of problems that architecture deals with are the spatial symptoms of deeper social issues rather than the social issues themselves. So for example, let's just say housing, right? We can't just, later on I'll talk about this further, but you can't simply build better and build more in response to poor housing, right? We have to think about the systems of support and sustenance that support this new, better built things. And these systems are things that are outside of architecture. So culture, economics, politics, and all these things are outside of architecture. Yeah. So I think later on I'll talk about how this discussion of doing things to architecture is actually very important.
These are questions now to the team, right? Okay. I guess can't read own writing. I just want to ask a question, short question, so that you use your imagination and then you can try and respond to that. Maybe this is directed to NUS First and CPD. As a different question. The first one I'd like to say is that you did mention that there would be a need for architects to collaborate with a team of people who are responsible for the project. How does this work when in the traditional planning of the city, you don't get these guys called the urban planners and urban designers who touch base with politicians first. And then everything else trickles down to some kind of a master plan for them. and the architect is given one of the neighborhoods or one of the buildings in the neighborhood. Just not trying to remember whether I'm asking the right thing or the right question. That should be the ICT already. So what is the what is your response to that when you say that it is wishful thinking? Yeah. I mean, how would an architect do something from bottom up?
Okay, first of all, to respond to how we need to listen to the planner, I think yes, listen to the planner. The planner is a job that is different from our job. Although we love to shit on URA a lot and complain, they are faced with quite different pressures. I believe everyone was pressured by something else. So URA planners are maybe pressured by, I don't know, LTA or NPARK or whatever, or CAS, all things that architects don't think about. So I think we need to acknowledge that there are really things that are out of control. And then the question of bottom up, I would say, is a lot more challenging. We are not trained to, we are trained to lead, we are trained to be solo artists and divas. And so I would say, yes, there are exceptional cases where architects do try to go from the bottom up, like PID and budget design, that's one I can think of. They're quite successful in garnering support from the bottom. But that's it, they still get funding from the top. Yeah. So I would say it's bottom up is difficult.
I think when we were preparing for this, we always use the word architects and architecture interchangeably. But I think now, I think to us, how we really believe is that these things are not exactly the same thing. Architecture can be produced by parties outside of architects alone. So this is a personal opinion, but I feel that in order for architecture to move forward, not only to the existing architects have to do what Ivan said, and collaborate with more parties, be more open to not just viewing their profession as something that is kind of siloed off and all that. I think we can start, I have no solution, but I think we can start exploring the idea of how can we acknowledge that people outside of architecture, or that everybody is capable of kind of producing something architectural in their own way. So this sounds a bit abstract, but this is kind of like, let's say if I dare to dream, this is kind of the ideal that I have now. Whether we can liberate architecture from architects.
Maybe just answer the same question. It's interesting to note the notion of the role of the architect. We want to cite a particular example of a new city called Askren in the suburbs of about 80 kilometers west of the Ringstrasse in Vienna. And a group of architects were charged with developing a new community which took consideration of women's needs, single women, married women, and they analyzed how was the city designed from the viewpoint of male city planners, which dominated at 94% of the time in 1997, this community. And they went and took a more feminist role in terms of trying to convince the city planners and government bureaucracy to change how they design the city, for people using perambulators or strollers, access, lighting, even parks, when women and young girls feel comfortable in city parks or not. And they failed. They found that just going from a purely feminist role, going to meetings of city administrators and politicians in Vienna was not working. So then they took a big breath. The next time they had a chance to develop this community, they asked those leaders, how would you like your daughter? How would you like your granddaughter? How would you like your wife to feel comfortable in these spaces? Would you like to improve their quality of life? And it was hugely successful. The project was finished in 1997. This received a lot of press about 20 years later because it's grown into, it's all performed 20,000 people, 20,000 places for homes and for working. And so this analysis 2 decades later found that architects, when they're creative for tackling this problem, how to redesign a new city from the viewpoint of making it comfortable for all genders, not just the previous establishment that existed in Austria, was hugely successful. So this is an example of that ability of the architect to play a profound role in impacting a space for multiple genders, multiple ages, and multiple participants after an initial set of systems.
question actually for the CTT, but quick response. The question is then, there's a mention of products and performing building and sort of safety environment. I just want to ask the SCTT team to address the issue of affordability of these technologies and how that would solve the problem to a different group of people who are looking at very basic fundamental issues. For example, the people in Sri Lanka right now. Thank you.
I think for our team, the examples that we brought up have mainly been quite high-tech. And these are more appropriate for a very highly developed city, for example, like Singapore. And it's not true that sustainable architecture is limited to just these fancy high-tech implementations. It can be as simple as changing materials that you use, using locally sourced materials like mud and stone and so on. And all of these provide very useful and effective solutions in a very cost-efficient manner. So there are examples, I believe, in India, where they are using mud and thatch and locally sourced wood to produce very cool structures, and cool I mean in terms of thermally, they are able to protect against sun and wind, and they also keep the houses very cool inside. And all of this is done at a very low cost. And I think architecture has great potential to expand in this area, not just looking at futuristic high-tech buildings for countries like ours, but also expanding into these simple, low-cost solutions that will be very effective for less economically developed countries.
Is there more religiously on traditional means that you really need more architects in Indonesia? And there are even architecture architects.
So you're asking, does that then negate the role of the modern architect?
Yeah. Because these methods are really traditional. Right?
No, I don't think so. I think the role of the architect then is to use some of this traditional knowledge. The modern architect is not entirely divorced from all of these traditional ways and knowledge and wisdom. And perhaps the role of the architect now is to take this knowledge and further develop it with our technologies to make it more efficient, to make it more accessible. And I believe that the role, in fact, is complementary rather than antagonistic.
Yeah, I'll just quickly argue. So, like, I think one thing that we need to make clear is that environmental issues as a social issue versus environmental issue. And the way architecture sort of intersects with environmental issues is very temperature, really like very So, for example, hot, like, okay, I say, right, this space is too hot, therefore I use architecture to resolve. Yes, I can sort of alleviate but that's not, we cannot claim that that is then solving the social issues of the environment. Which is way in fact just architecture to solve. So, I would then, of course, next question, when you do approach something through architecture, are you solving only the emergent spatial symptom of it, or are you actually resolving something? And I would like to remind the opposition where our position is not antagonistic to architecture. We're saying architecture can meet social issues in certain ways, in very specific ways, but it cannot, in any case, resolve them.
I think we need high-tech architecture solutions actually. I think the word sustainable is not actually what we want. It's sustaining a system that doesn't, it's sustaining the current system. So if you look at it, even if you build the most, even this building has so much important factor. Maybe we even need to build it. Yeah. So does the architect have a position to say, I don't want to build something, which is the only solution to the climate change crisis?
Thank you, Andreas. Next up,
First, let me thank both teams for putting forward quite a compelling argument. There were very good examples on both sides, architecture projects that would fit into the narrative argument. So I thought as a question, maybe I can bring everybody up to the same level and to want to hear your views about a single project. So I'm going to use one of the examples from the SUDD team, Complementary team. I want to discuss the idea of scale, understanding of social issue, understanding of scale, impact, and demonstration project as one of, and where do you see that as a scale scope of architecture or architects? A bit of context about Kampong MRT. It has won many awards, local, global. The citations, if you read, a lot of it is about brilliance behind the idea of co-locating these services. But if you go one step further, if I'm not wrong, it's like 200 units in the development, which is actually a very small number of community residential. And because of the co-location, polyclinics and whatnot, they do have a certain minimum size of population needs to serve. So as a solution going forward, is it, do we see more Kampong MRT side by side because it doesn't work because of the things that's co-located within it? But based on its impact, it's very small. It's only 400 residents can enjoy this kind of integrated benefits. So as a demonstration project, may be successful, but is it, I want to hear your views on this as a larger impact towards the 80,000, 90,000, 100,000 residents and development, and do we see that as a good example, or actually it's a one-off trophy, right? So the end and maybe both things can kind of maybe just a bit of context. I think I didn't expand on that. I think if I understand the history of the project correctly, it was a collaboration between HDB and MOH. So it was already decided at the policy level, which is the top-down approach that Joseph spoke about, that they are going to co-locate housing and medical in the same facility. So this was the top-down project, and it was then either through competition or she is assigned to MOHA. And so there is complexities in merging programs together. But I think my question is, if you read the citations of the awards, a lot of them focus on the co-location. And so that's the question, actually, is the architect the winner, actually the policy makers decided the brief was the one that was supposed to. So I think that's the part that, and I think it depending on how you argue the case, whether architecture can solve.
So our argument is that, first of all, I think we should not use awards to assess buildings. I mean, first of all, the awards were given, the building was not even used like for more than 10 years, 20 years. So who's to say that the residents there are not enjoying a very high level of housing? So I would say maybe it's not successful. And secondly, I really doubt architect is the even of one thing in Singapore has the ability
I'm trying to acknowledge that a lot of architecture is being very demonstration mentality. Like it's not meant to be only repeat this every single time. This is actually kind of like an example to show other architects, to show other institutions what can be done through architecture. So from our side, I think our response to demonstration architecture is that we do acknowledge that it has that potential to kind of inspire or to propose a new way of living and whatnot. But going back to our original point that architecture cannot operate alone, right? I think demonstration architecture exactly highlights that it's not the architecture itself that's what's wrong. The architecture is trying to demonstrate something so that other parties can follow in their example. I don't think they want people to replicate exactly the same thing one to one. Right? So for example, like even going back to kampung environment, let's say they put a lot of green spaces in the houses. Maybe what they can show other developers that you can put green spaces one on one. Yeah, they don't want that exact example to be replicated one to one. They want to set an example. But setting an example requires other people to follow. Requires other people to feedback. Yeah. So architecture needs other parties to react. That's what I'm saying.
Thank you. Probably might pose the same questions to the other team.
Yes.
Having witnessed architect Richard, who's I believe wheelchair-bound architect who used to work at Walmart, he spoke in great detail about that kind of management. The policy changes in the programming of the building were a direct result of the architect's office. Going down the green rating space, the actual programming, the initial response was the hawker center food space must be on the ground floor. It cannot be on the second floor. Nobody's equivalent to the second floor. And that was the correct policy set forth, and they changed that there and moved it to the second level. They also did not initially want healthcare services above the food area for fear of types and possibilities. So they put an interstitial mezzanine mechanical space in between that, so this would be a viable solution to sort of catching failure of plumbing systems. The other component that they changed from a tile product to a more environmentally sustainable brand product, and there are the matching price points for that product, manufactured product, very obviously natural gas intensive tile to a naturally affordable product. So the architect changed the pre-assembled policies for how the building should be stratified through obviously educating and policymakers about the advantage of these systems.
I would like to address something about awards not being relevant in assessing how good a building is. So awards look at very quantifiable statistics, correct? So I believe that if you want to assess something whether it's good or not, you look at both quantity, the qualitative and the quantitative. So awards do bring value to the quantity side of things, and it's not to dismiss the qualitative side of whether I feel happy in a building, but it's just so hard to put a number to quality, right? So awards are still indeed quite relevant in positioning whether an architecture is good or bad.
To support that, awards reflect the interests and priorities of the leaders in the built environment and of the larger community, and also the point about maybe kampung community residents doing like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Team SATD. I'd like to move on to our final judge from Christine, please.
Yes, okay. One of the last ones, so I think a lot of the points have been brought up. Maybe I won't directly make questions, but maybe get some comments and then you could respond to the comment. I like that Chen had brought up, I don't think actually I was but I had the privilege of hearing about the project from OHA's perspective when they talked about it, and also from HDB's perspective when we invite them to come speak at the housing studio. And it was kind of amazing how proud they both are. And you could see when OHA spoke about it, they indeed, sort of threw out the point that the brief that they received was excellent, right? And only through sort of questioning that they say, yes, the brief was one of the reasons why they could do this. And then when you speak to HB, they are very open and very generous in complimenting the architect, right, to be able to fulfill the vision, right? So I think there's something here when, and I think that because the format of debate is so extreme, right? And it's easy, to disagree on both ends in some way. So I really appreciate after this round of questions questioning that adds you a little bit of nuance in the way that you argue, right? So the NUS team, when we talk about sort of the nuance of say, we can't do it alone. But it is hard for me to agree though. Whatever, we understand architecture is kind of at the end, the receiving end of a brief, right? Somebody crafted the brief. And when we get the brief, do you have the power, right, to sort of not just fulfill, but resist if there is place to resist, or undermine? Sometimes we do give them the things they want, but more, right? So I think our profession seems to be tapped to be able to do that, right? The kind of negotiation within the complex set of rules. So I would, maybe the question would be, do you agree that we are able to, as a profession, right, negotiate these complexity, right? Well, we understand our requirement as someone who's hired, to respond to the brief, but do we have the power to then somehow negotiate more for the occupants or whoever who's going to use the building, right? I think, I lived in St. Louis. And Prodigo is one of the burden I think the architecture profession has to bear, right, I would say, since that, right? So I felt the whole, generation of architects that followed that event, right, has to almost prove themselves, right? And the whole idea that modern architecture can kind of bring impact. So that is a negative example, and I don't know, it might be as a proposition, that we do need constant positive examples like the awards, However inadequate we are to give face to the ability for architects, right, to kind of make impact, right? Because one negative example like Prodigo really sort of disempower the profession from being able to be at the table, right? So I guess what SCTV team was trying to say, and I don't know, maybe we can talk to that. How do we then, as architects, not be only at the bottom of the receiving end of the brief, but perhaps try to be involved in the crafting of the brief, right? So I think that's a little bit of what I hear the bottom up, or the ability to have a space at the table. And I wonder if the way to get there is to have a bit more promotion of what we do, right? And hence the star architect, and maybe the question would be, what does the architects help, right, in giving us kind of good examples? I don't know if there's a question, but I'm sorry, because the questions are already asked.
I think Prodigo looks exactly like initially estate, but without the supporting structure, kindergarten, hospital, roads, all the things that actually have control. So I think that's an example. It's a bad example, but the only reason why we think that it's a bad example of architects is because we take on this burden of having to say that he can solve solutions. That's why we
there is actually very little room for the design team to push that further. And yes, they can look at that. That's the reality of the face industry.
Thank you, Prof. Wilson. I think I would now like to invite SETD that opportunity to respond.
What we did in construction in parallel with WAS, the next number is the architect firm of field office architects in Yunnan, Taiwan. And there were both in Yunnan and also in Danshui, County Dance, where they have been both entrusted by the client and their governmental efforts by the local government to produce quality architecture space in Yunnan for participate every respect for public space of the performance of the summer. And so they did this through, obviously, a pre-established reputation, but developing the notion that they're providing an architectural service for a theater, not just for money-paying visitors, but they provide quality space in the project for locals that may not be directly going to see the show, but they're enjoying the quality of architecture in the show. So they're one wonderful example where they accomplish that goal.
One time I would like to respond to this question, or Christine's question about how architects can sometimes push the views and whatnot. And I really hope that's the case. I think we all hope that that's the case. But I think I am also very cautious that we should try to avoid situations where we misconstrue pushing the brief with kind of giving, say, capitalist forces a veneer of improvement or something like that. So I'm thinking of a very personal example. My dad was going through the Gap Noodles work, and he has a lot of Gap Noodle projects and all that. Then there was one page where it said that Gap Noodles was initially paid by a client to build like a mega Korean company, those that can manufacture anything under the sun, to build like a mobile phone factory. And then suddenly there was some financial changes or something, and then suddenly they got a brand new injection of cash. So the original client was telling them that, we don't want you to build a phone factory anymore. Can you build for us a weapons factory? And then Gap Noodles go into like, the DIG architects, we support, we are signatory of like, Sustainable Architects 505 treaty. So we did not build a weapons factory, and then we built a phone factory instead. So this example makes something of moments where kind of architects do improve things, but never so little. But then the overall core of the project can be quite problematic. So I think that's also one thing that I would like to point out, which goes very like about what I'm saying, the decision to not review. I think apart from improving the brief and all, which is a very important part of architects and what we should be doing, we can also kind of shift our focus to really putting more focus on the idea of how do we not review. Yeah. So not reading sometimes might not literally kind of entail really literally not reading, but some of you judges have mentioned the idea of resisting. So in line with the idea of improvement, I think it must also be kind of complemented with the fair balance of the idea of really designing to resist as well. That's what I think.
There's no other remarks from both teams. We'll move on to the next segment.
So for the next segment, we're opening up the floor to pose a question to both teams. So similar, the format will be the same as previous segment. Each team will get 2.5 minutes to respond to each question. You will take about 1 minute break for my select the topic.
then I'll bring the mic over to you and you'll also be getting a voucher. Okay, nice. We have one audience member.
Hi, so this is a question from the NUS team. So I was wondering, should we treat architecture as if it's purely a summation of built works, or does it extend beyond that into the knowledge systems that have derived themselves from these? You know, for example, for the fluid idol that you use, it's not an issue of the architecture, its form, or its sort of design or its intent, because actually there are a lot of these elements which appear out in other public housings, especially in Singapore's ones, which have been deemed successful, but it's actually the result of context, such as white flight, growth of suburbia, all these things such as systematic racism in America, right? So those same systems applied in other contexts allow these architectures to be, these social issues to be solved. You know, and then the architecture is not just the building, it is also the systems it's set up and allow such buildings to occur, templates and precedents. It becomes an expose on systematic racism in the future. And even its value as a negative example provides academic value for today, for people to solve future social issues. So when you say that even if it doesn't serve the purpose of immediately solving social issues through its construction, that it ultimately produces value that could serve and solve social futures, solve future social issues, you know. And wouldn't that merit its value as something that could ultimately change the world?
Okay, thank you. I think one thing about that question, embedded in the question is the definition of architecture, right? What do we define architecture to be? And then if we take this architecture and put it into another context, then it speaks to its source of success, right? I think because of the scope of the debate, then I think both of our teams sort of skirted that because it's too big a discussion to encapsulate in this debate. So I think what we've done so far is look at the intersections between social issues and architecture and then interrogate, how much work does architecture actually do, right? So to answer your question, yeah, it's
what about like paper architecture itself? Like let's say like Ebenezer Howard, Garden City, ultimately a lot of those principles were applied to even our sort of urban planning, right? So there are things within that written on paper, purely in the context, no context. It's architecture by itself that will ultimately provide value that solves social issues that occur today. So when you say that ultimately also has value that solves social issues up to today.
So I think there's a distinction between architecture being able to affect affect some kind of social positive change and resolving social issues. Those two things are sort of related, but we cannot, just because architecture does do some work on social issues in a positive way, we cannot say then that work is equivalent to resolving social issues absolutely, right? Yeah.
So learning from your mistakes. So like you look at Grenfell Tower, and that is definitely a case where the architect has succumbed to some kind of market forces to specify a much cheaper and more dangerous product.
I think also in paper architecture, we have to really think about what, there's a specific example of class. What part of this architecture was? Like how much work, if we use that template, how much work does architecture do? What other parts of it sort of support this as a group? It's not purely form, not purely including. There's a plan, right? Most of the class will spot the different sectors, right? There's outside of architecture, I would say. But it's included as this whole
about blue ego, about architecture in general. One reality is architecture is expensive. So even if a project fails and it kind of offers some learning lesson or something, it shouldn't happen too often. Because there is benefit, but in economics there's also cost. So cost benefit analysis, it creates this benefit, teaches people about, but we must acknowledge that there's also a lot of costs involved.
Okay, so just to point on the point, so paper architecture tends to be sort of siloed away from how architecture is produced or the means of production of architecture. So there's another thing that is counterproductive to this argument because we want to see architecture as how it's produced, not just in abstraction.
Can I respond?
housing here is owned by people who eventually get the profit from the sales of 1.4 million flat somewhere in Dawson. And then they actually want a $1 million flat in Punggol, so I guess. Most people who don't know what public housing in Singapore is confuse it with social housing, the West is great. When you don't own it, you can't people on the low economy sector, then you have problems with crime. So this lots of so here is that the HDB plans have been perfected and was here from since the Tiger's time. And I think here then the question is, what is the value that the architect can bring? If he is constrained with regurgitating the same plans but in different configurations, and make the block architecture different. So I think it's going to go deeper than that. So my point that is made here, the value that the HDB brings to society is that the owner can profit from it in time to come. In Hong Kong, there was at one time a tussle between the developers who built public housing and the developers who built detaching kind of condominiums, and that the spatial quality and the sizes of the public housing surpassed that of private. And it's happening now sometimes. But actually what has happened is that if you look at the old point block in HDB, which was 150 square meters, 170 square meters of 3 bedrooms, you don't get that size now in the shrunk here. But the value is risen. And now the problem that arises is how do we make HDB housing affordable to the first time buyer since it's gone. But the value again, appreciating even over 99 years, is a big difference. You cannot draw a comparison with food. Thanks.
Thank you, Prof. Now I'd like to invite the CTD to respond to the previous remark.
Thanks for the question. The audience question. And we're going to next audience question address us. Because that was addressed to the audience.
Comment that may or may not be related to what we discussed earlier, but it got me thinking about for-profit architecture, let's say like HDB. The point is to earn a profit, right? So the idea of for-profit organizations and organizations who strive want to provide social good, there's this misconception that they can't be complementary to each other. So the one way I explain this is, so let's say a for-profit firm like Snowhatter, they one of the most famous architecture private firm for-profit who have come up with ways to how to make like the building zero carbon. Yes. So money drives people, right? Money drives people to innovate. So we can't dismiss just because a building is made for a reason for profit. It doesn't take away that it is able to influence the entire industry to be more like Snowhatter, let's say.
Alright, thank you. Now we would like to open back to the audience again. As anyone else would like to pose a question to the both teams.
Hi. Okay. Question for the NSC. So I really like the nuance on the architecture of the collaborative method and everything. But I would like to know like how far that collaborative, say, spirit would extend. Like there's been a lot of talk about top-down pressure from like, say, LTA, right? yeah, beyond just the top-down, pressures, needs, requirements, like from to the top, is there any kind of room for, or like in your idea of, architecture being more of a collaborative endeavor in solving social issues? Is there more room for more, bottom-up approaches from different kind of areas of expertise or artists? Something like that. Yeah. Just like kind of to get a pin down on what that would look like exactly. Yeah.
I think what you're asking is a big thing, like almost like an escape from current mass production, right? Because right now there's a very distinct line between who can produce architecture and who cannot. Like, okay, I mean not everyone, but most of us here will not be able to suddenly just want to just start building there, right? There's a very distinct line between who can fund and produce this architecture and who cannot. So that is the first thing we need to solve. To spin on its head before we can even think about bottom-up architecture, right? Because even if we keep these middlemen, I mean, of course, just to respond briefly to the previous point on how profit, it might seem like implying that profit and engaging in social issues is incompatible. But what we're saying is that there's a very clear bottom line that orients itself around profit and commodification, right? To some extent, yes, it doesn't preclude architecture's capacity to do social good, but at the end of the day, we will never sacrifice profit and money to enact social good, at least in architecture. So the bottom-up approach, I think we have to be very careful, like for example, participatory design, right? Whether that's really liberation from current mass production, because at the end of the day, you still need someone. There's still so many curators that are very close to capital that would say no, right? If this thing doesn't make money sense, right? So those need to get out of the way. What we need to really do is provide the tools and the means of production for people to produce their own architecture, right? But in most cases, historically, we don't recognize those things as architecture. Yeah. A lot.
He's trying to say that we need systemic change, and we are not in a position to enact systemic change.
And this systemic change is not.
It's more than that. Yeah.
Right, I understand. But
I'm not asking for revolution.
Right. No, I understand there's like a lot of changes. But I was thinking more along the lines of like if that change was made, what that would look like.
Yeah. So as this discussion being made, I actually had some ideas. Just now Dr. Joseph actually mentioned traditional architecture, but what I thought from the point, he mentioned the idea that traditional architecture has been around for the longest time, and we didn't need architects to kind of there were architects that differentiate and false, but we don't have architects as we recognize as how they are today to make those things happen. So what this illustrates is that, for me, I personally believe that actually non-architects are inherently capable of some form of architecture. So how can architects support this innate kind of drive, which is that, as per what some other groups have meant, as what SUTD has mentioned quite a few times on these ideas pop up, architects actually have the knowledge, right? They say they can complement them with new research and whatnot. And even when you look at some of the biggest architecture firms, or it's A&O, right? They exist solely for the purpose of amassing knowledge. So what I believe is that one route of thinking I was taking is that architects must participate in the design process. But I also feel that what architects can do, we can take a side role and focus on the idea of supplying architectural knowledge more actively to the larger community. Yeah, so with education of architectural knowledge, I think we can compel more people to create their own architectural inventions. Yeah.
Would STG like to comment? Well, I think your team for agreeing with us that education through architects is paramount, which is a point you made earlier. True architecture does not exist in most cases without a marketplace of some sort. And if you are familiar with capitalist marketplace, we would argue that technology has always found a place for the creation of a market. In other words, in the past, sawmills were non-discriminatory for the trees they cut down. They actually burned the sawdust because it was a fire hazard. And over time, with the technological advancement, well, now we have managed forests. Consumers and architects are both aware that you can do sustainable forestry and select certain species of trees. Plus, we can use it as sawdust for adding to the contaminated elements and reusing that for example, as a cardboard and other building products. So through technology, even in a marketplace, this market always.
Thank you, SCTE. In light of time, we'll be moving on to the next segment. So now we'll be inviting SCTE to provide their final remarks.
Thank you. So to reassess here, as we, the opposition, have repeatedly demonstrated, the architect is the creator of quality architecture through the selection of the actual building materials used within. And hence we resolve society's social issues with a wide variety of scales, both urban and rural, for the benefit of humankind. Design strategies such as sustainable building material sourcing, the employment of emerging cottage industries employing under-skilled construction market, and influencing these construction markets, create the design of urban villages which do address the needs of both working men and women. This is a showcase of how architects can problem solve society's demands for a better future for all its citizens and entities. Socially responsible architects did not get this accomplishment in a vacuum. We actually obviously cooperate with responsible government and responsible new policies to accommodate emerging architectural materials, new building materials, new technologies for these use of these materials, and new methods to employ labor in a more equitable and responsible manner. So this all has been done and can be done and will continue to be done here in Singapore, paramount even for Southeast Asia's utilization of materials and labor. And technology architect is paramount in this area.
Thank you, Prof. Dan. So in the past half hour or so, we've heard the points raised by the opposing team, announcing the usefulness and power of architecture in enacting social change. So the opposing team has not yet addressed the following key points of our argument. Indeed, yes, we cannot think about architecture without the support of other economic and political or policy interventions. But that's the nature of a city and an urban environment. Likewise, one cannot escape being poor, sick, or hungry. We're still living on the streets if there is one to begin with. The opposing team also brought out that some of the examples that we raised could be exceptional, but this isn't the case. In Singapore, 90% of us live in public housing, and Singapore's model of public housing has been exported around the world, showing that this model is not, showing that public housing and large-scale infrastructure interventions are mainstream. We've also shown that the free market is not antagonistic to good architecture, but in fact it can drive improvement and the better addressing of issues that concern architecture's inhabitants the most. Finally, architects don't work in silos, and the age of this gentleman architect is long over. The very nature of this profession is one that incorporates multifaceted needs, concerns, and considerations to provide a holistic solution for all. So yes, we cannot do everything alone as architects, but the built environment is the framework upon which these future political, policy-based social and economic developments can be grown on. Thank you.
Alright, hello. Okay. Just to address the points that were just immediately brought up. That I stress that we cannot. We have to look at the word resolve very carefully when we say architecture does do some kind of positive work on social issues. Resolving social issues, as Waihan has brought up, is that social issues are very complex. I think, of course, the debate has been skewed because if you replace the word architecture, biology, engineering, I think none of these singular fields can ever resolve social issues, right? So what I want to do is really now just zoom out a little bit and ask what it really means when we say doing things through architecture. Because I'm sure we can all agree that confronting social issues via architecture is distinct from how a policymaker and artist might approach these same issues. Right? So for instance, a policymaker thinks about and addresses social issues through the material and tools of writing and research, which then lead them up to some kind of policy for a business or a government to follow. So now, an architectural approach, on the other hand, interacts distinctly with the spatial aspects of social issues. So many social issues manifest spatially, with one familiar manifestation being housing. So broadly speaking, what produces and reproduces housing issues is a combination of land speculation, commodification, and systemic social stratification. And although we feel the effects of such social issues at the architectural level of housing are then by impulse driven to respond to them architecturally, a purely architectural response to it would be insufficient in resolving the social issue of housing. Right? Because simply building more and designing better would be akin to treating an emergent symptom of a disease rather than disease itself. Without liberation from ongoing systems, these better designed housing solutions tend to be circulated out of the hands of those who really need it and into the possession of people who are interested in amassing property and capital. So we therefore argue that an architectural approach is meaningless without the presence of systems that are able to support and sustain it. These systems, however, largely lie outside the domain and control of architecture, and that is paramount, right? That these supports and systems are outside of architecture. So to reinforce this point, let's look at a successful example of architecture and social issues. So this is Villa Verde, located in Constitution, Chile. So after an earthquake in 2010, housing needed to be constructed under very limited resources, and within these constraints, Elemental, the architecture firm, decided to provide each family with half a good house instead of a full substandard house. So through this strategy, families would immediately get the essential housing they needed without compromising on quality in the long run. This half, which is the reddish portions you see on the slide, included the essentials that occupants would never be able to build at home. So things like concrete foundations, plumbing, electrical wiring, kitchens, and bathrooms. They could then build out the second half of the house when they were better prepared and better resources. So architectural websites, magazines, and even the firm itself accords much of the scheme's success to what I have just talked about, which is the architecture. But we must not erase from this narrative the support of systems outside of the architecture for this scheme to work. So for example, economic safeguards were put in place to protect the neighborhood from land speculation and the buying out of entire blocks. The scheme also required receptive participants who were in a position of scarcity to learn and pass down knowledge of construction to the rest of the community. And on this note, Jennifer Stoloff, an expert in evaluating government housing programs, actually demonstrated that such a scheme would simply not work in the US due to differences in culture and how people in the US think about property. So this actually shows that there are a whole host of things outside the control of architecture that need to be present, even in successful examples like those given by opposition and the one up here. So now to wrap up the debate, I will now reiterate our team's position in relation to the motion. So the proposition stance is this: it is wishful thinking to believe that social issues can be resolved through architecture. The proposition has argued this position on two main fronts. First is that the way we produce architecture limits its capacity to resolve social issues. In this current mode of production, architecture is built with a distinct bottom line that orients itself around profit, commodification, and land speculation. And as our second speaker has illustrated, this in turn makes architecture an ineffective tool for making headway in social issues. Secondly, when architecture utilizes an approach to resolving social issues, it only works when other systems are in place to support and sustain this approach. A purely architectural approach, on the other hand, will only ever address the symptoms of social issues that manifest spatially, but not the social issues themselves. So with that said, perhaps our position today may fill many of us with clouds of doubt. So why pursue a field that cannot resolve social issues? Or perhaps it may seem to us that architecture is still in a state of separation from social issues altogether. So to that, I would say this: we are not saying that architecture is no place in resolving social issues. What we are arguing for is a precision in positioning architecture in relation to these issues. We should let go of the notion that architects need to have everything under their control. It is only then can we realize it is okay to have a limited part to play, focusing instead on how we can collaborate and work together with fields and communities outside of architecture. Thank you.
Thank you to both teams for your enriching debate and your closing remarks. Now, before we move on to the voting segment, we would now like to let us by any final comments to share with both teams on points that were brought up today.
Hello. Okay, I just want to say thank you for having me here. It's my first time attending debate. we didn't have it back then. Yeah. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. Good job, guys, for putting all the contents and being out there to deliver this. I think it's not an easy job. I think even with the mask on, you guys are able to speak very clearly. Yeah, so I like the part where actually I'm able to understand easily. But some segment of it could be a bit too rushed, too hasty. I think resolving, I couldn't follow it down. Yeah. Otherwise, I think good content, good flow. collaboration on social issues because we are hearing a bit more of Singapore context. We are very much well provided. Actually, we will travel a bit just out of country to the region. Personally, I'm actually a practitioner who travel to Cambodia. We see a lot on all these social issues. They are actually like poverty, inequalities, and lack of sanitation and so on. I feel can be touched on if good, right? So otherwise, I think both teams actually put out a very good effort. And I just want to touch something of my own personal opinion. Actually, I feel that architects produce architecture. So I think because the audience here we are basically architects to be, right? So I feel we could all take a lead to actually make a positive change to all these social issues. That's for sure. So today's the spirit of this segment is actually for us to better understand the problem facing. I think the good thing is actually is after the session, probably would like to reflect on it and actually think about how we can move on from here. Something that to put the studies to good use, and what's important is actually take the action and make it happen. Yeah, so that is actually something that will take a lot of courage and determination to actually solve all these social issues. Personally, I actually believe in it. Right, I've accomplished a couple of projects, not too big, but small enough to just to raise some awareness. So a message to all the students here is actually believe in yourself and believe in the system. And actually, just do our best. Okay, thank you.
Again, thank you to both teams. I'm not sure whether you realize that you were converging on your points the more the debate went on. I think for the purpose of trying to sort of define your position, SUTD took a role to widen the definition of architecture. The NUS team took the opposite stance of narrowing architecture to the fact of production. Right? So I think that is the strategy that's quite clear, but on a larger level, you are arguing about the same thing, which I think maybe to the audience is that there is a role that architects and architects play, maybe not resolve, but addressing social issues on different scales, paper architecture, building architecture, or even in policy making. And the question about top-down, bottom-up, actually, if I'm not wrong, one of the key members behind the policy of Kampong MRT, she's an architect, right? So you have architects in the policy, and you have architects producing the architecture, and the research surrounding is also supported by architects. So in a way, architects and architecture are in all fields, and if we argue the act of producing architecture, then yes, it's a very key sort of system that we rely on, but architects have a potential to play a larger role, and it's evident, and we've seen that happen. So I think it depends on your definition of architecture and architects, then that's why I see both of you. So I think it's encouraging, and I hope that this conversation can
Thank you. I think that's a good closing. But thank you for the last argument in NUS team. That was pretty well put as well. But I was wondering, if the message is we be content, right, with the limited power we have, limited role. And yes, I guess in singular projects, somehow, because of the circumstance, maybe it's good to be content. But I think if you look at arc of any great architect, right, who has through the history of his production in his lifetime, there's always this level of discontent, right? It drives him to kind of push for the next little thing that he can do. So I think that's kind of a dual thing, right? You would be content so that you continue, because you have to find happiness, right, within what you can do. But then a level of discontent to push you to do the next level, the next thing. So yeah, I agree that the argument is converging. Thank you for giving us so much thought-provoking session. Thank you.
Thanks. I think most of the majority to me, my take home is that listen to the website, there is this need for greater collaboration across that transcends all the borders of science, and to see things in total. And the point of systemic integrated is the value that policy makers can bring as social contribution. An example that I mean to say is that with the state subsidies that are given in public housing, the benefits to the owner of the public housing unit is that he can profit from the appreciation of property in the long term. That doesn't happen in social housing in the West, where the problem of housing in the low economic sector is a problem that has to be solved in some kind of building, and which can fail because the real solutions do not lie in housing itself, but in ways in which you can bring up the economic potential of that group of people. I'm always inspired by this story where, you know that famous song, I Will Always Love You, that made, where the royalties go back to, who's that singer, the white singer? Dolly Parton. And even though it was Whitney Houston that made the song a big hit, Dolly would enjoy all the royalties from Whitney. But what she did with the money was that she donated it to a part of the American city to develop the potential of the black community that was under, they were the underdogs, okay, they didn't get access to public education or something. Now that is beyond architecture, that is policy that is not as good as the art. What then comes up to the thing is what's the role of architects and architecture, and it's got to do with these things that here we've got all the other disciplines that are contributing to the problem. Perhaps what architects and planners can do is to translate that into how this can make an advantageous official space that solves the problems over time. One thing I can think about the settlement right now is that maybe for the past decades we've been thinking of building megacities, and now really the question that you should ask yourself is how small can the settlement be in order to be self-subsistent so that we do not suffer the limitations of centralized logistics when they fail. How small can the settlement be to be self-subsistent in order that we can create our own environments, not that fit our own culture and context. So these things I think are questions which perhaps designers and architects, maybe together with the designers and planners will ask themselves to make sense of new inventions that come from other fields of engineering, technology, chemistry, that we can use. So here I am, yes, they know on the position. And congratulations to the teams for making this very complex issue understandable to all of us here today. Thank you.
Thank you to all our judges for their insights and all their advice. And thank you again, once again, to all the teams for their really convincing arguments today. So we have actually come to the end of the debate segment, and we'll be commencing the voting segment shortly. So we'll be inviting you to proceed to our archival exhibition going on at SDE 1. So there'll be ushers along the way to guide you to the exhibition. So this exhibition is just like a curated exhibition, an exhibition of curated works from year 1 to year 5. So in the meantime, as you leave the venue, do remember to place a sticker on the voting board outside the door, and then you can proceed to the exhibition and where some light refreshments over there.
So we get the first, like the back two rows to exit fast, so there's enough time for you to pass the vote. And at the same time, I believe our judges will be deliberating on the results of the best
So because, only because you're going along.